Hey, it's Mike here, and today the unexpected risk of mouthwash use, in particular antiseptic or antibacterial mouthwashes, which up to 200 million people in the US use every single day. That's over half the US gurgling this death liquid every single day. No, we're gonna keep this level-headed. We'll talk about actual risks. It's really an interesting story between bacteria and arteries and nitrates and chemicals and various disease risks. And I've recently seen this covered on social media, but they never go into the mechanisms here and the cycle within our body that exists that is super interesting and absolutely worth knowing about. And since this video does cover bacteria and our microbiome, it is appropriately sponsored by Seed Synbiotics, which we'll cover briefly in a little bit, but let's just get into it. These antibacterial mouthwashes have been shown to increase blood pressure, which of course increases the risk of heart disease and stroke, and they've independently been associated with an increased risk of diabetes. As promised, we'll get into that mechanism, but we also need to infer the potential risk for some other diseases that would logically be very connected to that mechanism. And as we've known now more and more, bacteria, especially just your own beneficial bacteria, have a pivotal role in terms of health. And it doesn't stop with your gut, it also apparently has to do with your mouth, and that brings us to those nitrates. In particular, the nitrate, nitric oxide pathway, which, like mouthwash, is a total mouthful. Oh. It starts with nitrates, or NO3, that are eaten in the diet, 85% of which come from plants. The remaining mostly comes from drinking water. Some of those nitrates are initially broken down into nitrite by the salivary bacteria that we have, the denitrifying bacteria such as Neisseria. And with all the hydrogen ions in your stomach, that is then oxidized down into nitric oxide, which can be absorbed into your bloodstream. So we actually go from NO3 to NO2 to just no, which in this case actually means yes. I just realized that sounds really bad. But that NO, or NO, nitric oxide, is a really powerful artery dilator, helps with artery function and a ton of other things. The most important immediate effect is that dilation increases blood volume, meaning you're gonna have less blood pressure pushing up against your artery and potentially causing things like heart attacks. And in terms of heart disease, having smoother blood flow is just so important for so many reasons. But from this paper, quote, in addition, its powerful antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and anti-thrombotic actions, that means anti-clogging actions, are, end quote, super good at stopping arteries from clogging. That's a paraphrase of those words. And as one of those mouthwash effect researchers, Nathan Bryan of Baylor, said, quote, "We know one cannot be well without an adequate amount of nitric oxide circulating throughout the body." Ooh. And his next quote goes pretty hard. Quote, "Yet the very first thing over 200 million Americans do each day is use an antiseptic mouthwash, which destroys the good bacteria that helps create the nitric oxide. These once thought good habits may be doing more harm than good." And if you've seen my videos, this is one of the recommendations of Dr. Esselstyn, who's obviously done great work in terms of heart disease. He says to eat 6 handful-sized portions of steamed dark leafy greens a day to keep a constant flow of nitric oxide around the body, especially in older people with severe heart disease who can't make as much as well.
A wonderful level of nitric oxide keeps your blood flowing smoothly, like Teflon, rather than Velcro. Look, I'm greedy for the health of my patients. So my cardiac patients are asked, at least for the first 3 to 6 months, 6 times a day, I want a green leafy vegetable after it's been cooked for 5.5 to 6 minutes, the size of my fist.
This is also important. I didn't realize that there was a Nitric Oxide Society that has a journal of nitric oxide, and they've published this study on diabetes, which brings us to the topic of insulin and diabetes. This study found that twice daily use of the antiseptic mouthwash chlorhexidine meant an increased risk of diabetes by about 50%. If this does happen to be causal, what could the mechanism be? And this brings me to insulin, and this is something that I discovered while researching this video. According to this paper, it not only plays a role in insulin signaling, but, quote, deficient nitric oxide is implicated in the pathogenesis of insulin resistance, so it could be helping to start it up. And from this other study, quote, insulin resistance is improved by nitric oxide at various levels, including insulin secretion, mitochondrial function, you know that's the powerhouse of the cell, and modulation of inflammation, insulin signaling, and glucose uptake. A lot. But this brings me to one of our body's cycles that most people have no idea about and I think is super fascinating, and that is called the enterosalivary circulation of nitrate. I had to read that, I'll be honest. So our beneficial mouth bacteria don't get a chance to turn all of the nitrate in the food in our mouth in that moment into nitrite. And so what happens is as we absorb nitrate in our intestines, most of it's peed out, but 25% of it is actually circulated back up out our saliva into our mouth so that bacteria can get a second chance. We essentially recycle nitrate to get a second pass at that beneficial bacteria. Amazing. And this just shows that this is such an important process that our body has created this whole cycle in order to keep our nitric oxide levels higher. All right, now a quick break with our video sponsor, Seed Synbiotics, which, as many of you know by now, is a combination of a prebiotic and a probiotic, and it is specifically coated so it can make it past the onslaught of your stomach acid to where it needs to be. Each one of these little guys has 24 different strains, and it is a vegan capsule that you get sent monthly in super eco packaging. And if you've been following along, you know I've been spotlighting studies, and I want to talk about this randomized control trial, which I found to be super interesting on atopic dermatitis, which is the most common type of eczema. They had two groups. They had your probiotic group that had 2 different types of bifidobacterium and a lactobacillus strain, and then you had the control group, which just had like a dummy pill. And here's the result on that eczema severity, and you can see the placebo group did not do as well as the probiotic group, which went way down in severity. And of course, you can find some of that bacteria in the Seed Synbiotic. And in case you're wondering, Lindy's digestion is still doing really well after using Seed, so that's pretty cool. She no longer has an easily upset digestive system, which is amazing, and I hope it helps more people like that. And finally, if you want to seed it up, you can click the link below and use my code MIC15 or MIC15 at checkout for 15% off your first month's supply. All right, moving on. Now it's time to hit all the important points on mouthwash and the effects of mouthwash. You can probably figure it out by now. Antibacterial mouthwash sort of nukes that good bacteria in your mouth, and then of course leads to less nitrite conversion, less nitric oxide in the blood, less artery dilation, and an increase in blood pressure and cardiovascular disease risk. The effect is so immediate that these researchers found that within 1 day of giving this antiseptic mouthwash, they saw an increase in blood pressure that's sustained through the whole week-long study. But just how much of this process are the mouthwashes preventing? Well, it appears that about 90% of the nitrite conversion in the mouth was stopped. And that correlated with about a 25% decrease in blood nitrite levels. And at this point, we have to touch on mouthwash brands and the active ingredients, and most of the studies are on chlorhexidine, but it appears that anything that's going to be just bleaching your bacteria and killing them are going to have this effect because they'll stop the bacteria from doing their job. And of course, how much damage other ingredients besides chlorhexidine are gonna do depends on like their concentration and their potency. But again, killing bacteria is killing bacteria. But in terms of brands that offer antiseptic mouthwash, we have Listerine, Colgate, and Crest, and of course way more. And I've seen those throughout my pretty much entire life be heavily advertised. Next up, we have a study that did something interesting. What they did was they fed vegetables to people and they measured the nitrite level increase, and then they gave them mouthwash to see if it would make a difference, and lettuce was a vegetable in the study that had enough to make a nitrite difference. But when they gave people mouthwash, it essentially squashed the effect. Anyway, moving on, there is a whole nother pathway to create nitric oxide, and that is L-Arginine. L-Arginine is a second intrinsic pathway that our body uses to create nitric oxide. It essentially just breaks it and get some nitric oxide from that. And arginine supplementation can increase nitric oxide. However, in this study, which was just on mice, mouthwash again did squash the benefit. Perhaps that was for messing up the other mouth-based conversion that those mice had. And we'll talk about arginine in a bit when we get to diet, but let's move on. I had to mention that there is an oral hygiene process that could actually help in this area, and that is to this study. Tongue scraping could help cultivate that denitrifying bacteria such as Neisseria, which again is linked to better cardiometabolic health. Let's go! Too far back. There's also another really interesting process that occurs in skin. Who knows how clinically relevant it is, but it could be beneficial, and that is that nitrate that gets in your bloodstream can, of course, make it toward the surface of your skin, and when it's exposed to UV, again, we're talking about something oxidizing and turning into nitric oxide. You can create nitric oxide from sunlight in your skin, as this study showed, which actually has a section called Nitric Oxide Production in Human Foreskin Cells. Just get your skin where you can. We'll get to the important dietary information in a second, but first we just have to think about how pretty much any disease that is going to be negatively affected by worse artery health and artery dilation could be made worse by mouthwash. I mean, we're talking about things like erectile dysfunction that depends on artery function, and we're also talking about things like Alzheimer's. I don't believe studies have actually been done directly on mouthwash and dementia risk. This is so new and that's such a long-term disease, but from this paper, quote, "The link between cardiovascular disease and the central nervous system's degenerative processes in patients at different severities of Alzheimer's disease is likely related to the depletion of nitric oxide." And as you can see by these two charts, nitrate levels on the left, which are used as a marker for nitric oxide, drops through aging and also more severe Alzheimer's disease. During the same period, we also see a drop in the ratio between blood flow and brain size, something that you want to stay higher. And finally, from this graphic, you can see the dropping of nitrous oxide corresponding to the dropping in circulation, and Alzheimer's is all about blood flow to the brain. Also have to, of course, mention something that a lot of you nutrition nerds already know, and that is that dietary nitrates can increase the oxygen efficiency of our cells. It really helps athletes out, but of course, it can also help in terms of diseases, things where oxygen is really important. We're talking like anemia, lung diseases, and heart conditions. And on the topic of lung diseases, we have to look at COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. From this study, quote, "Recent human studies have demonstrated that dietary nitrate improved the exercise performance and reduced blood pressure in COPD patients." And that's why now we just need to touch on diet, because it's obviously so important here. You know, what are the greatest sources of nitrates? We can also look at arginine, etc. What are the plant foods with the highest nitrate content, so you can really boost it up there? Well, we have various ones. You can look at this chart here. We're talking about arugula, spinach, lettuce, and beets all being, you know, more or less at the top of the list, and great choices, especially because you're gonna eat more beet than you can eat lettuce in terms of weight. But if you're trying to get a lot of this, the best bang for your buck might be starting to learn how to do trays of microgreens of spinach and arugula to really get a lot of that for cheap. And again, it's a good idea to get enough arginine. I'm sure a lot of people already are, because it's really high in a lot of nuts. Nuts are a great source. We're talking about walnuts and almonds and peanuts all being great sources, as well as pumpkin seeds. So get those nitrates and get those artery gains. But I do want to keep a level head here about the risk of mouthwash, because there are certain people who, of course, the equation is going to change for in terms of risk. I mean, there are going to be people with gum disease that could be better off still using these types of mouthwash, and of course that's up to like your dentist and your cardiologist and on and on. Gum disease, due to the inflammation likely, is associated with an increase in heart disease risk as well. So again, the balance changes. And now for a slight tangent, I just have to mention that during my review of the literature on this, there was one topic that came up a lot, and that was COVID and mouthwashing. And that's just a really interesting topic for me, but it probably doesn't need a whole video. We have this study, randomized control trial of frontline medical workers who did a nasal and oral rinse of like electrolyzed water, and they had a 90% reduction in COVID cases for those that did that mouthwash compared to control, which is ridiculous. But in the end, bacteria is really important. There are cycles within our body that most people don't even know about that, if interrupted, can have dire consequences in terms of risk of various diseases, from cardiovascular disease to diabetes, and probably diseases that haven't been studied with this connection yet. And it's obvious the oral breakdown of nitrate into nitrates and then nitric oxide in the stomach is super important for our body and how our arteries function, but just nuking that bacteria is perhaps not a good idea So keep all that bacteria healthy, of course, including the digestive bacteria. So I have to mention, if you do want to try Seed Synbiotics, again, you can click the link in below and use my code MIC15, MIC15 at checkout for 15% off your first month's supply. And finally, let me know what you think about this. Do you use mouthwash? Are you freaked out about this? You know, what do you think? And feel free to like and subscribe and all that good stuff that helps me out. So thanks for watching and see you next time.